Hey guys, I'm Gilad. I'm the chief data scientist at Betaworks, and thanks for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about social data and specifically dive into a product that we built around segmentation of users in social networks. So first, a little bit about Betaworks. So we're a startup studio in the meatpacking district. We've been around for quite a while in startup terms, 9 years, so that's quite a lot. And we build companies. It's predominantly what we do. We also invest in early stage companies. You may know many of the companies that have come through the studio, such as Bitly, Chartbeat, Giphy more recently. And what we do is effectively bring interesting people into the studio, and within a few years, typically we launch companies. So it's a longer term investment. It's not like your typical accelerator where it's sort of a few months, you get someone in a few months and you throw them out. Well, we bring people in and really focus and dive into certain ideas and try to figure out ways to productize them. There's a lot of work around media and kind of where media is heading, repackaging media, and a lot of focus on kind of data. So many of our tools have some interesting data aspect to them. And I lead a team that works across the different companies. And so predominantly what we do is build companies, but we also invest. So we were one of the first to invest in companies like Tumblr, Kickstarter, and a handful of other names that you may recognize. And so I want to start with a story that'll lead us to some of the work that we've been doing. And I'll take you back to December of 2015. Where this event sort of started to take place. Information about a potential shooter started to come out in San Bernardino. And we started to see things like this start to spread on social networks. We didn't know much as the event was taking place. We had no idea who the person was, what the motive was, what happened to people there. And as more information started to come out, especially as the name of the person came out, and it was a Muslim name, it was really interesting to see this phenomenon happen specifically on social network spaces. So there were two very different frames under which people were using to respond to the event. So on the one hand, there's a very kind of actionable, realistic, kind of fact-driven frame saying, okay, well, this is another shooting. We clearly have a gun problem here. Comparing to other nations, other countries around the world, here's the data, and here's why there's a clear problem, right? Very fact-driven. Here's another example of folks responding to the event saying, there are weekly mass shootings in this country. That's not okay. Look at all the other countries and how we compare, okay? So that's one very specific kind of frame and way in which people responded directly, immediately to the event. Now, on the other hand, you see things like this, where instead of talking about the event itself, talking about the name of the shooter, right? And also talking about why media will not necessarily talk about the fact that, or large mainstream media accounts will not talk about the fact that it's a Muslim name, right? Media blackout, silent. All right, very different kind of take on what was going on, very different kind of frame. And as we started to look at all these responses, being a data scientist and sort of working on products at the intersection of data, social media, I started to map out all these people who were responding to the event, to the shooting, and their connections. And what we see here is a graph representation of all users. So nodes represent users this is specifically Twitter data, and the edges in this graph represent connections. So who follows who, right? Effectively the interest graph or the social graph. And when applying some math to the graph, helping organize it, helping identify kind of more central nodes, but also helping identify communities, and we'll talk a little more about some of the techniques that we use. This structure emerged, right? And this is something, as someone who works in the space, I've seen over and over again. Right? So incredibly polarized space where people are typically connected to people who are somewhat similar to them. And the reason why it was very clear was once we started looking at people's bios, so the way people kind of called themselves, how they described themselves, or the kinds of stuff that they were sharing, the separation was very, very clear. So on the one hand, in this sort of the red cluster of users, they're what we labeled as gun safety advocates, but people kind of using the first frame, which I showed initially, so very fact-driven, pointing to all this data and statistics saying, hey, we have a problem here. Look at the data. It speaks for itself. And on the other hand, we saw two different groups that were clearly very interconnected. As you see these two colors, on the one hand, these firearm enthusiasts, so just people who like hunting or people who are just really into guns, and there are a lot of people who just love guns, as well as these group that we called Second Amendment defenders, so people who in their bios pointed to the Second Amendment, to their right to bear arms, right? And the way in which they talked about the event, again, that was the second frame that I showed, much more emotional, much more kind of pointing at media. And so if we just, to see a few examples of these types of profiles, here are a few examples of these firearm enthusiasts, so just people are really, really into guns, and then the kind of stuff that they would share, right? Hey, Obama, it's going to be tough to blame this on the Amish, right? Our terror attack in Paris isn't mass shooting because that only happens here. But terror attack in California is because that only happens here, right? And so kind of questioning the authority and what counts as a terror attack. Here's some examples of people who really identify with the Second Amendment. So in their bios, in the way they describe themselves, they use hashtag 2A or 2A to represent this Second Amendment. And then on the other hand, the part that we saw, the red kind of cluster of users, these so-called gun safety advocates, right? So people who are pointing to facts, pointing to the fact that there is a problem and trying to make a difference, right? And so what's going on here? Like, why do we see these structures in place? And this is somewhat polarized structure is something that we see over and over again, specifically around political issues. So on the one hand, we have something called homophily at play. So this is a well-studied phenomenon by social scientists, and it effectively means love of same. So in the physical world, we tend to want to be around people who are like us, people who love plots and data, like it's more fun for us to be around. We may choose a house in a neighborhood that reflects our kind of ideals. And so we do that in the real world, in the physical world, but we also do that online. And so we thought, or it was thought that, the internet, especially social networks, are this incredible place that brings us together. On Facebook, I think we're all on average of 4 hops away from each other across the almost 2 billion users. But actually, what plays out on these networks and on the web is we stay in our familiar neighborhoods, right? So that's homophily at play. And that's much harder to affect. That's kind of innate to our sociality and humanity. The other thing that's at play here, our dynamic, is a whole slew of systems under this bigger label, algorithmic ranking. So we've all seen these aggregate lists, like here's the most popular stuff, here's the top-rated stuff, here's what's trending, here's what we recommend for you to read, here are people you should read, right? All these systems that try to make sense of what's going on and make personalized recommendations for us all and for users, with the goal of keeping users within the systems as long as possible. And so one commonly used technique called collaborative filtering. Amazon uses it heavily and relies on it for product recommendations. So you can think of aggregate data about people and purchases. And if you liked or purchased 2 articles, you may be interested in a 3rd article, given all this aggregate data that we know about, right? And Amazon has a lot of information on products. And I know many of you have experienced their recommender system. It works really well, right? You end up buying all this stuff you didn't intend to buy, but actually, like, I could use that set of balls when I'm buying a little pool, blow-up pool for my kids. Yeah, I didn't think of buying the balls, but now that you showed them to me, I might as well buy them. But what happens when we apply these methods to media and content? And especially at a time where the majority of people, or there is a large majority of people who are getting their news from social network spaces, specifically Facebook. So what happens in this case is very clear, where we reaffirm sort of people's beliefs and we keep them in their kind of comfort zone, political comfort zone. So effectively, with homophily, with various forms of algorithmic ranking and recommender systems at play, your position in the graph completely affects the kind of information that you're likely to see, right? If you're in the red side of this plot, it's unlikely that you will see what the folks in blue or purple are posting, and likewise goes to the other side. So just to give you a sense, if we zoom into this kind of top cluster, the main kind of headline or piece of content that was spreading that day after the event evolved and after we had information about what happened, this was kind of the headline or the piece of content, right? And if we zoom into the other, right, the red gun safety advocates, this was the headline, right? This is kind of their newspaper, the piece of content that really spread. And so if we juxtapose these two, I mean, it's really striking because we can't really say that one is fake and one is true, right? There is some aspect of truth to both of these headlines, but there's a lot of spin and significant amount of frame, right, and agenda setting. Right, so this is just one example out of millions that happen continuously, day to day, constructing these online filter bubbles in our social network spaces and helping us reaffirm and sort of keep us politically in our polarized zones. So what are we doing? A little bit about kind of the algorithmics that we're using or the techniques that we're using. Effectively, we're taking a group of users and we're trying to construct a network graph that represents or help us understand their relationships, right? So in this case, a node represents a user on a social network site, and the edge represents a connection between them. In the case of Twitter, it's directional. In the case of Facebook, it's bidirectional. And what we really are interested in is constructing this large graph that represents all these users' connections and understanding its structure, right? Where's their density? Where are their hubs? Where are their nodes that are sort of sitting in between, right, that have high potential to bridge across different sides of the graph? And so we have some really useful mathematical measures that help us make sense of these structures. We use various centrality measures. So betweenness, for example, helps us measure how many short paths a node sits on. So effectively, if this were a map of highways or roads, this would be a central junction that the big highways cross, right? So it's a way to easily get from any part of the graph to another part. So that's kind of interesting, especially when we think about potential for information to spread. And a lot of what we do is think about that. We look a lot at in-degree, right? So thinking about specifically important or strategic positions in the network that have high concentration of inbound edges. So people who are heavily followed on one side or another side are effectively these local authorities who can potentially influence or impact this group of users. We use a lot of methods to try to effectively partition the graph. And so one approach is looking at something called modularity maximization. So effectively trying to find regions of density where in the graph we find a lot more connections than a typical graph would have. And that's interesting. It points to some unique thing that this group of users share, they have in common. And if you notice in this graph, like both of these regions share a lot more connections within each group compared to the rest of the group. There are very few points of bridging that happens in this specific network. And so one view, we can look at important nodes within each group. So the Brady campaign in the red, right? They're one of the more central accounts, so authorities within the group. And we can look at high betweenness, right? So we can say, well, who has the most high potential to bridge across these two super polarized spaces? So when we think about information, media, and specifically news in a world of networks, we really need to change the way we're thinking about it. And instead of looking at audiences as kind of binary, so are they my reader or not? Do they consume my content or not? Did they share my link or not? We need to start thinking, taking a more networked approach. So thinking about users in terms of hops away. How far away are they from me? How important are they within their hub, within their community, right? How likely are they to pass this piece of content onwards? I think that there's a sense that social networks are kind of a leveling field. Everyone has the potential to put some content out there and it'll spread, it'll immediately become viral, right? You put it on YouTube and lots of people will see it. Well, there are true points of power in networks, and they are not equal at all. So just like you saw in the graph, it's very unlikely that a piece of content will spread from one side to another, but there are also differences in sizes. So there are people who are much more important within each group and are much more likely to have their content spread in these spaces. Right? So there's true power embedded within, depending on your network position. There's homophily at play, and there's little we can do about it other than work on education. So make sure people are informed and aware of the fact that they are sort of building these walls around their beliefs, where there's much more potential to see content outside your own kind of little filter bubble. Same goes to different algorithmic ranking systems, right? We can do a lot better in bridging the divide. The problem becomes thinking about kind of business goals. So if your goal is to optimize time spent on site, it's hard to start showing people content that they may feel uncomfortable with, so content from the other cluster of users. So how do you do that in a way that maintains your business goals, but also helps build kind of better awareness across the divide? And just generally thinking about this world of increased polarization, I think especially after last week, we all realized, wow, it's really hard to get outside of our own kind of political bubble, and how do we do a better job at making sure we do that? And so with all that in mind, what we do really well at Betaworks is build products, and we continuously kind of try things out, put it out there and see what sticks and what brings value to people. So we spent some time on this idea, and we built something that we launched a few months ago. It's an attempt to sort of leverage this kind of information, this kind of user segmentation, but also give you the ability to take some actions. And so this is a view, and if we have time, I can show you a live demo. But this is a view of a kind of segmentation. This is Prop 63, so gun debate proposition that was I think it was passed in California last week, which means you need more significant background checks for certain types of guns in California. And so just specifically looking at the people responding to this proposition, we could immediately see these 5 clusters of users, right? 5 communities or 5 groups of users that had shared a lot more in common with each other compared to the rest of the graph. And when we started to dive into each group, we could see specific agendas. So on the one hand, a group talking about gun violence. And we could not only look at the kind of the segmentation, so who's important within this group, and how do the kind of most important connections look like, but we could also see the top kind of things that they care about. What are they sharing? Like what else are they doing? Public actions in aggregate, what are they doing on the site? So in a way, this tool helps you kind of get into the mindset of a specific type of user. On the other hand, we could look at people who were against this bill or this proposition and cared a lot about the ability for people to freely hold guns and ammunition, right? And what were they sharing? What kind of stuff, what kind of content were they trying to push? What was their agenda, right? So in a way, using this tool to dive into the mindset of these users was kind of illuminating. And there's a bunch of stuff that we built with this tool. So it's very kind of visual. So there's a way to zoom into the graph to identify important people, identify connections between users, but also see sort of anomalous events. So by tracking specific cohorts of users over time or tracking aggregate activity over time, we can identify moments in time where there's something happening, like something is taking off within this group of users. Oh, they're all sharing this YouTube link, or they're all pointing to this specific piece of media. So use this tool. One of the fun things that I get to do now is use this tool to tell stories. So one of the stories I told more recently, a few weeks ago, after one of the debates, I was looking at a specific hashtag that took off. It was hashtag Trump won after the first debate, and answering questions around agenda setting, like, no, actually Russians weren't involved. It was just a group of supporters who were pushing this hashtag and making it trend across the world, right? The interesting thing in hindsight now, I remember looking at this data and diving into the community of Trump supporters and just seeing, all right, what are they sharing? What kind of stuff are they? What does their reality look like? And they had, I think I have it in this post from a few weeks ago. One of the things that they were sharing that day was a poll that came out that showed Trump beating Hillary by 4 points. I was like, no, there's no way that could happen. But thinking through, okay, well, this is their reality. Maybe my reality is completely skewed. So again, really interesting way to dive into these different groups and what they care about. Just to show that, I've used it significantly in different political contexts, but we've kind of pointed the tool to different online communities. And if they exist, we can find them. Obviously, cats and dogs. And if you look at communities of animal lovers, they actually split by preference to animals. So there's always a big cat group, always a big dog group, obviously. But then you get these reptile lover groups, right? These snake lover groups. So it kind of gets interesting to see what's trending in the reptile fans today. They're clear kind of sneakerheads, people who really love sneakers. Their dad communities, obviously, parenting is huge. So we built this thing. It's out there. Feel free to try it out. It's very visual, and we'll see what we'll do with it. We've yet to find out. So I think we have 5 minutes. Instead of showing you a live demo, which you could always see, we actually have 1 minute. I'll open the floor up to questions. So thank you. Yes? Yeah, no, we're buying data from GNIP. So, I mean, we have a lot, nice access to Twitter data. And, yeah, it's expensive. That's all I can say. Yeah. Yeah, so great question. Are we effectively part of the problem because we're putting people in these even smaller groups? And I would say one of the biggest issues is identification. So what we're doing well is helping identify the groups and helping show that there's a big problem. Like, these realities are very different. People are constructing different realities. And I think that's the first step. Luckily, consumers don't live through our tool, but it's, I think, to build awareness and understanding of the polarization that's happening, this is a first step we have to do. And then you can take various actions on when you have this understanding. Yeah? Yeah, I mean, there are a number of measures, graph measures we could use to look at cross-cluster ties. So how many connections actually cross between the clusters of users, what's their strength, et cetera. And does information actually spread, right? So on the first level, we look at the actual structure of the graph, but then we look at the flow, right, information flow. Yeah? Groups of harassers. So how do we use this to help mitigate harassment on Twitter? Well, one thing we do really well, we have a bunch of classifiers for spammy accounts and bot-like accounts. So if it's harassment that's coming from kind of spammy accounts, we can identify them and filter them out. For actual harassment, I mean, there could be features that are added in based on some trained classifier or looking at level of activity, but we haven't done that. That's Twitter's problem, not our problem. One more question, because I think I'm going to get kicked out. Yeah.
So what is the scale of the graphs you're working with?
Sorry?
What is the scale of the graphs you're working with?
What's the scale of the graphs that we're working with? So they can get in the millions, in the tens or hundreds of millions of edges, so million nodes, 100 million edges. If we want to take this to the billion node level, we have to work a bit on our infrastructure.
So your system, can it handle billion node graphs right
Yeah.
now? It
Yeah.
can? Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.